All righty. We have got a good number of folks here with us tonight, and I can see that folks are continuing to join in, so we'll let folks trickle in. You'll see that we're also live on Facebook, and folks are watching. Um, so we really appreciate you joining us this evening. My name is Alison Rice. I'm the campaign director for this campaign, and I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. I'm going to kick off this meeting with just a few ground rules, just talking about what to expect here tonight and a few things to keep in mind as we go about this conversation. You'll see that you do have the chat available to you, and that is so that you can ask questions during this conversation. We ask that folks use the chat to ask the questions during the first half of this session and remain muted during this time. There will be a chance to get your questions addressed later on, and we'll signal when we open the program up for questions. We'll look to the chat for those questions that folks have asked during the first half of the session and address those in order. And folks are welcome as well to continue asking questions in the chat as we go about answering those questions, and we'll note when we have time enough for those questions and when we are closing out. And if folks would like to ask questions out loud, please use the raise hand function located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or write your name and question in the chat and we'll get to you in order of appearance. One really important thing I want to note is that we want to ensure that this conversation is informative and productive. We ask that you please demonstrate respect for our speakers and for each other in this space. We are able to manually control microphones and cameras of attendees, and we can help folks if anyone is having trouble maintaining that productive environment. You'll see, as I noted at the top, that this is being streamed live to Facebook and is also being recorded. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce Amy Mah Sangiolo to you all this evening. Amy is a longtime Newton resident and lifelong Democrat, a former city councilor at large in Ward 4, an advocate, a public servant, so much more, and a candidate to be our next mayor. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Amy Mah Sangiolo.
Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight's forum, and thank you, Alison, for that wonderful introduction. As many of you know, my name is Amy Mah Sangiolo, and I am running for mayor. I'm a former city councilor who served on the council for 20 years. So thank you again for coming. So tonight, this is going to be the first in a series of community-wide discussions that I'm going to host to address issues that affect the quality of life for all of us Newton residents. The purpose is to openly share information in a non-judgmental forum to gain knowledge so that we can make Newton an even better place to live. That is for human residents, not for rats. So with that, let's get right into the subject matter. Dr. Corrigan, I'm very excited that you're here tonight with us and you're able to join us this evening. You are the rock star of rats. Bobby Corrigan has been active in the science of urban pest management for over 25 years. He's a consultant who specializes in pest management programs for cities, mega shopping malls, and large international airports. He consults for several of the largest corporations in the US and several of the US's largest city governments designing rodent and other IPM programs. Dr. Corrigan.
Okay, thank you, Amy, very much. And thank you to the city of Newton for inviting me on this, I think, important topic. I think everybody can agree rats do fall into a category of quality of life. You know, it's interesting, I'm by trade and by degree, I'm an urban rodentologist. And some people never even heard of such a position. But, you know, and I respect rodents and I scientifically admire them as mammals. But at the same time, you know, rodents in our cities and towns like Newton, it's somewhat of a mammal we really don't invite, right? It's an uninvited guest kind of thing. So, you know, I'd be happy to discuss this tonight. I'm going to take you through some tidbits about rats and dispel some of the myths that are associated with rats in our towns and cities. You know, and a town like Newton is a perfect example as to what's happening around the world, and that is generally rats are on the increase. right? So, you know, we can go through this, but I do want to mention it's very wise, I think, of Newton as a town and city to be proactive. Just the fact that you're having this session and offering this shows you want to be ahead of this. I live in New York City, and I can tell you that as part of the Eastern megalopolis, where, you know, we're right down the road from you guys, and the rats arrived in our city about the same time they arrived in Boston. And to some degree, if we were a little bit more proactive back then, New York City is known as Ratropolis. We probably are the #1 rattiest city in the United States and one of the tops in the world, right? So had we been a little more proactive 250 years ago, roughly, we probably wouldn't have that title of Ratropolis. So, you know, I do want to point out there's a lot of myths right now going around that the rats are getting worse because of construction. That's not true, right? The rats are getting worse because of the pandemic and they're becoming more aggressive. That's not true, right? There's no rats in Newton or anywhere in Massachusetts or New York that are super rats that are immune to all poisons. There's no rats in Newton that are as big as alley cats, right? In fact, I would offer a challenge to anyone here tonight that if you bring me a 2-pound rat, just 2 pounds, I'll write you a check for $500 because I would love to have that in my mammalogy collection, okay? So many myths, right? So, you know, it's important, however, that we address rats as a mammal, the same way we would address managing any animal population. Rats,
Well,
go ahead, Amy.
no, thank you, Dr. Corrigan. So we know that rats are a problem in the city, and they are negatively impacting the quality of life for many of our residents. So in a recent newsletter that Mayor Fuller had put out, she says that we have the same number of sightings as last year. But, you know, from what we're hearing from the community, that's just not the case. So you alluded to the fact that it's not necessarily because of construction, but we're seeing changing patterns because of the pandemic, maybe, or something else. Do you know, have thoughts on that?
Well, you know, that's a key question, and it's, again, all over since the pandemic affected the entire globe, Amy, on this. So there are changing patterns, without a doubt. When everybody shut down, you know, all the restaurants closed in all our towns and cities, many of the rats that were depending on that trash and that food trash that, you know, in our communities that goes out every night, no longer was there. And so we did have a shift somewhat. The rats, you know, they cannot go hungry for too many days without trouble, you know, for themselves. So there was a shift. The rats started moving, searching for food. So we did have people also working remotely, and they were at home working off of their computers and so forth, and probably began to see rats in backyards more often, rats out the window more often. Many times it was stressed rats. They're active at night, but during the pandemic, they tried foraging whenever they could. So there are some factors there that cause the rat populations to perhaps be more visible, but it's a dynamic that as a biologist, we don't have any empirical data like you would for a journal paper to prove that. We only have hypothetical, you know, considerations.
So what are you seeing in other cities?
Yeah, so I, you know, as a consultant, as a rodentologist, I travel around the world literally, and I can tell you that around the world, rat populations are up. And so my records from doing my own surveys and scientific investigations and talking to other scientists, the population seemed to be up 15 to 35%, depending on which city and the conditions of the city and the age of the city and many, many factors. But in general, I think it's very safe to say the populations are up, you know, and that's the way it is. But, you know, if someone says how many rats are in Newton, for example, or how many rats are in New York and compared to 3 years ago, you know, we couldn't possibly give a number. We only can see indications like complaint data.
So Are there previous lessons learned from your experience dealing with rats in other urban environments that you think we should be considering here in the city?
You know, it's kind of interesting. I started out by saying, rats are a mammal and there's a lot of science with them, Amy. The bottom line though, rats depend on us for our food for the most part and some shelter. So even though it's a complex mammal in complex environments, it's also very simple. And that is a city, if a city says we wish to be a rat-free city, and that's what I work on, is trying to design rat-free cities. I'm like, this is not about which poisons you're going to use. That's the wrong approach. This is about a city managing their refuse stream very tightly controlled to details. Because if there's no food, it's a mammal. If there's no food, there's no rats.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to open up to questions. And I'm looking at the chat. Do folks have any questions?
And
Okay, I'm going to go to Councillor Oliver. Thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for pulling this together. I appreciate it. Thank you for the conversation. And I understand, what Bobby just said in terms of, the pandemic's not increasing the population, construction, development isn't causing the population to increase either. What I am wondering is, what are the right strategies that you have seen to, cities like the size of Newton, right? How can we, I believe you said it in two different ways, right? Or what I heard, and I'll play it back that way, is how do we control, right, the food source in such a way that we can kind of stay on top of the challenges that we have seen increasing. I mean, there's no doubt that we have increased sightings, we have increased challenges. I see some names on the list of attendees here tonight who will attest to that, or who can attest to that. And I'm really curious, like, how do we kind of get on the front foot here?
It's a great question, and it's, of course, the essential question. But I would start out by saying this, that, when I work with other cities and towns to, keep the rat populations down, the number one most important thing before we even talk about the refuse stream is the city or town organized in this effort? And, rats forever, most people think, yuck, if we have rats, somebody call an exterminator, or somebody do something. But rarely do towns and cities think of rats as being worthy of an organized, scientific approach, as, say, there was too many deer in the local parks, something like this. So cities, the first step, they have to be organized. A lot of times in towns, I recommend, for example, with Newton, you have a group that, gets put together by the government, you guys, that's Rat-Free Newton, Rat-Free Newton group, or whatever you wish to call it. And that group, would divide up various tasks. For example, you'd have a group within that group that's managing data, keeping data of complaints, plotting maps where it shows the highest populations, like heat maps and so forth. Because if you know how the rats in Newton, and say downtown Newton and Newton Center and your various components of Newton, you would be able to, know where the enemy is, so to speak, and have a plan. And just as an example along those lines, I would say, if you look at Newton, and I've been through your town, I've been through that area, many of the suburbs of Boston, but how does Newton look 25 years now from 25 years ago in terms of number of restaurants? You know, how many restaurants have increased along Beacon and Center and Union Street and those kinds of things? I bet it's dramatic. And if we just use that example of what do all the dumpsters look like, you know, and is there a group within your rat-free Newton group, for example, you know, perhaps 2 members of that group would do some simple dumpster walk-bys and get an idea. So it's about getting organized. It's about using the city's, you know, structure as well for inspections and making sure if you have some bad players that, you know, that ruin a block for everybody, that's addressed within the city government. And so I guess I would say the most important thing is you're organized and you have a partnership between the city's duties, the business community, and the residential. And on the residential, for example, I think we all can relate, you can have a block of 10 beautiful houses, gorgeous, and everybody's maintaining them. But one of the 10 doesn't. And they don't do their trash right. And maybe there's a lot of clutter and they have junk piles in the backyard and so forth. I guarantee you that one property will ruin it for the whole block with rats. The rats will emanate from that one property up and down that block. And everyone will have the perception is the whole block has rats. Yes, they're seeing rats. The whole block is seeing rats, but one property is causing them.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. Susan Donnellan. Can you unmute?
Unmute. There we go. I think you kind of answered my question already. I'm a resident of Newton. I live in the Nonantum section of Newton, and I actually live abutting a property very much like what you just described. So I was sort of first wondering, you know, what strategies you've seen work in communities like that, where there is sort of one identifiable property that's, you know, the hub, if you will, and how, you know, how to manage that between a group like a Rat-Free Newton and city administrations to sort of get things taken care of in a quick manner, I suppose. You know, I think in any community you get, you know, the most houses will be fine, and then you get the house that has, you know, the clutter and the home base for the rat population, and it's tricky to navigate. So I'm just wondering if you've seen examples of, you know, communities sort of get taken care of that quickly.
Right, Susan. So, you know, and it is a sensitive one, and it's a little bit of a, you know, a tricky one among us, you know, where we, you know, we're trying to share a block and we may have people that we work with or see and so forth. So it's a conversation sometimes that's difficult to even have with a neighbor that may be really nice, but they're just so busy or something.
Exactly.
That they may not realize that they're not taking out their trash correctly. So, you know, the soft approach is always the best at first of perhaps, you know, if that's why if there's, say, a, you know, Rat-Free Newton committee and everybody's in it together, right? You're all in it for public health and quality of life for Newton. And so, you know, as simple as, you know, doing surveys, everybody on the block, so you don't single out a person and just say, you know, here's a door hanger with some good information. You know, we're noticing the rats seem to be picking up on the block, and we're hoping everyone will be aware of that. If there's no food, there's no rats. And so here's some tips, you know, how we should do our trash and so forth. And can we help you? Are there any questions? After the soft approach, of course, then it begins to, you know, then the city structure for inspectional services division or whatever it might be may need to make a stop by and also do an ask for, could you please address, you know, the issue, so forth. And, you know, and you hope over time you'll have responsiveness. You know, we all know sometimes you don't. Now, if you don't, I would say this, since you're a neighbor, Susan, and kind of thing, rats look for different areas to get rewards. And so even though your neighbor may not be the best neighbor, you don't want to make sure that they also find any rewards whatsoever in your property, because
I was just going to ask you. Yeah, I was going to ask that as a follow-up. What can I do if we're not getting a, you know, a quick response, you know, just to sort of batten down the hatches on my side of the fence, if you will, so that, you know, because I've literally seen them pop through the fence from the yard I'm speaking of over to my yard. They run around for a minute and realize there's not a whole lot for them, and they pop right back. So, I mean, what are there specific strategies that I can put in place? I mean, I know I secure my trash. There's not, you know, a harborage for them back there, but is there anything else I can be doing?
You know, the other things you can be doing, Susan, is make sure you check the bases of your doors, right? You
Mhm.
know, measure the base from the bottom of that door to the floor. If it's a half an inch or more, a rat can get in.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure your doors are rodent proof. You want to make sure there's no holes through any utilities going through your foundation. And if the rats seem to be, and sometimes they do, they'll come over and they'll say, you know, we like Susan's property for digging burrows better than we like the property where we're finding food. Then you'll have no recourse too much other than to hire a quality pest management professional.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay, good question.
Thank you. We have a question from Ravi.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first off, we are not sure that construction doesn't disturb rats because we've had direct experience with exactly that. We have a property that we've had, you know, pest monitoring on the outside for years because we're scared. And we've had no signs of rats at all. And then when a giant construction project happened 2 houses down, we noticed that there was a giant pile on that construction site left there for 2 years, dirt pile. We saw rat activity in the pile. We were worried about it. All the neighbors were. And soon after, when they started disturbing that pile again to put it back in the garden or whatever they're making over there, all those rats left that huge pile. And this pile was, you know, 1.5 stories or 2 stories tall. It wasn't a small dirt pile.
It was called the Rat Taj Mahal by one of the
by pest control companies. Yeah. But so those rats ended up on all our properties and in our deck, and we didn't have any change in our garbage habits. We even stopped growing food, you know, vegetables and things like that, because we didn't want to attract them.
We stopped grilling outside.
Yeah.
We were careful with our trash. We picked up our dog's poo, every poo.
Yeah.
We took down our bird feeders
Yeah.
immediately, so there wouldn't even be a seed on the ground.
Yeah.
No vegetables in the vegetable garden, and we encouraged our neighbors to do the same.
But the net result was we had tens or, you know, a small number of 100 of rats under our floor level deck that were never there before. So we're not sure how to interpret this sort of, you know, conflicting empirical evidence with the fact that Bobby's saying construction doesn't cause rats. I don't think it causes rats, but to the extent that they are undisturbed and they have shelter and the food is somewhere else, maybe that's what's happening, and then eventually they get disturbed and they go somewhere. So that's probably what we are observing, but we are sure that the construction is, if not the ultimate cause of the rats that we've observed, it's at least the proximal cause.
So if I could, and thank you, Robbie, for that. The wording is critical here because I did say construction doesn't cause rats, right? And that's important because there's many construction sites where there's no rats present at first. So just digging up the ground, you can't spontaneously cause rats to appear. So, but you are right and you said it early on, construction can disturb rats if they are there, and it will disturb the rats if they are there. For example, you know, if you dug up all the streets of Newton over the past 100 years, and you looked what's below the ground of the streets and the alleys and side, you will find all kinds of pipes and abandoned, you know, old sewer laterals there is a world of stuff below our streets. Rats over time, they move into our sewers. I guarantee there's rats living in the sewers of Newton. And I guarantee there's rats living in many of the abandoned old sewer pipes when new pipes were in there, you know, those get capped off and so forth. But as soon as you do construction in an area where that old sewers are, and there's old sewer pipes and there's old utilities, Newton's an old area. You will disturb any rats from that area with all the digging, and they will run for their lives in every single direction. So that is correct.
And that's exactly what happened. There's a lot
Yes.
of like buried infrastructure, and they had to
Yes.
build an underground parking lot.
Yes.
So they moved all that stuff, and then they created this 2-story dirt pile. So I saw some comments in the chat saying construction is not a contributing factor, and I think it's really important to be precise for everybody on the call that it's not just construction doesn't cause rats, you know, that's sort of a natural process, but there's certainly the ability for a construction site to disturb rat populations and cause this issue that we had.
One
Yes.
thing we're hoping to do in this kind of meeting is to find out how to build out our suburban city without doing harm to the neighborhoods that are hosting developments.
Yeah.
And for that, I think it's important to know the ways in which we can disturb hidden functioning rat populations and shift them into the hosting neighborhood and beyond.
Yeah.
It has happened here in our neighborhood, but the utility infrastructure goes to the rest of Newton.
Yeah.
And what we want to have an understanding of is how can we sense what is happening subterraneanly on a prospective development site to do no harm.
Yes, and so let me address that point because it's a critical point, but you know, and this is where we said a partnership, right? And the role of a city. So for example, sometimes when construction is scheduled, there's a very common city code that says that site will be exterminated before the construction starts. And that code is very old and it was not very detailed, but it's pervasive throughout the world. And so what happens is a pest control company comes and they put out these black boxes with poisons in them, and they'll say, we are exterminating the rats of this site. So when you dig it up, there won't be rats running every place. Unfortunately, that rarely touches it, quite frankly. So two things. One is a situation where surveys of the area that is to receive a lot of construction, especially capital construction of great size, office buildings and so forth, that area needs to be environmentally surveyed for rats specifically. And that almost never gets done, quite frankly, because again, rats get overlooked. Then if there's rats in the sewers, for example, that needs to be done. If there's rats using alleyways nearby or undisturbed vegetational lots, that needs to be done. And then it needs to be addressed formally as to, before we start construction, what are we going to do about the existing rat population so we don't chase them in hither and yon to everybody's neighbors. So it's an environmental survey with rats being part of that environmental survey, but rarely are they part of that environmental survey. And I think that's a very important issue you raise.
Mute. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Corrigan. And thank you so much, Ravi, for asking that question. I've got Julia Maliki next. Oh, Counselor Julia Maliki from Ward 3. You're muted, Julia. Julia, you're muted. We can't hear you.
We're having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Yeah. We'll go to Counselor Tarik Lucas for now, and then we'll come back to you, Julia.
Maybe Julia, you can drop your question in the chat.
Can you at least hear me?
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that, Julia. Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much for joining this Zoom call. I have a question about rodent control management. I understand that using poison will be highly controversial just because of the effects that it would have on other animals, you know, dogs, cats, birds, things like that. But I have heard mixed reviews of using birth control pills on rats. What is your dealings with that, and what are your thoughts on using birth control?
Yes, so there is a product that exists right now that affects the fertility of the female rodents, okay? And, you know, on paper, you know, quote, and we'll use the term birth control, keep it simple. So on paper, you know, that would be a very good way to manage large populations of rats. So we don't have to reach for poisons and traps, and that's a whole issue that is very, very important, especially these days. We realize that the poisons are not just staying put with the rodents, they're ending up with hawks and owls and foxes and coyotes and, you know, and so forth. So we do want a humane approach. We want a smart, scientifically big approach. But birth control, there's an issue. And that issue is rats don't have closed populations. Meaning, let's say you have a yard and you put up a concrete fence and nothing can get in that yard or out of that yard because it's sealed against any raccoons and cats and dogs and so forth. That's a closed area. And whatever animals live in that area is a closed population since they can't get out and none can come in. But with rats in a town and city like Newton, you have rat colonies, probably, I mean, I'm just wild guessing here, but looking at, you know, and been to Newton, I would say you have hundreds of colonies from different parts of Newton that connect, even following the Charles River all the way westward and then winds around. You know, rats follow creek beds. That's how they disperse themselves, and river basins and so forth. How would you get control of enough of the female rats to get the population to not have offspring unless it was a very small, tightly controlled, closed population? So the other point to consider here, because that's called an open population. We've tried the birth control in New York City, and others have tried it in different cities. It's very difficult at a city level to get enough of the birth control out there to see an impact, quite frankly, and not have replenishment.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I'll turn it back to Amy Sangiolo. Thank you.
So just following up on that question, Tarik, Julia put in the chat, how big an area around an excavation site should be surveyed, and how do you determine that size?
Right, and so, you know, from the site, you know, if there's rats present, good research, very good research has shown that, you know, the typical rat colony tends to stay close to where they've established their nest. They want to stay close to their food sources so they can get to them quickly and get back to bed. They want to stay protected. But good genetic research and tracking and monitoring has shown that the typical rat colony forages anywhere from 90 to 450 feet away from that nest site. Now, just to be on the safe side, so to keep it simple, I would draw a 500-foot radius as the first inner zone of that problem colony area. And then I would probably double it with what we call buffer zone. And so then which isn't a lot when you think about it, you know, you're up to 1,000, 1,200 feet and kind of thing. And usually, you know, that's the area you want to do a very detailed survey and see. And again, I want to stress, it's very important, going subterranean, going substreet, going street level, and even above street level. So because rats will be in ceilings and walls of any old buildings and that may exist, they love ceilings. A lot of people are surprised, but they do. So that's the kind of survey area space I would recommend.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm just going to look in the chat.
We've got one from Lauren asking, when did the rat population start increasing? When did we see that increase?
Right. So, you know, I'm going to say that if you track the rat populations of the Eastern megalopolis, which is Boston down to Washington, D.C., right, that megalopolis, and probably the genetics of those rats are very, very closely related. So, you know, as we began to, if you track the human population and increases of all the cities in the megalopolis, if you track those, you're going to have a very strong parallel tracking of this species as well, since it is so codependent on us for providing food and shelter, right? And so to answer that question, I would say, you know, for myself, we started seeing some real dramatic increases in and around 2005 to 2010 area. And, you know, this animal multiplies on logarithmically. And so it can take these population jumps and spikes. And even if we do massive extermination campaigns or something has really hurt them, like this last flood has really hurt a lot of rats, as long as there's food and shelter, that animal species rebounds very, very quickly. But it was in somewhere, you know, they don't do census for them, so we don't know exactly, but we do know that we began to see populations become alarmingly larger in the early 2000s.
Thank you. I've got a question from Chrissy, who asks, are there any tips for keeping a rat-free compost bin? A lot of folks in Newton are very environmental and they're trying to do what they can to eliminate food waste going into our waste stream. So many people do compost at home. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so of course composting is great and it should be promoted, and rats really shouldn't discourage you from this. Composting, excuse me, composting though, just like when we get a fact sheet on how to compost correctly to make sure the compost pile is going to degrade and do what it needs to do, the thing to avoid with compost piles is put all your food scraps in it. It's not designed for meat and bones and chicken scraps and leftover hamburger or anything along those lines, because then it will become a food refuse pile instead of a compost pile, you know. But rats are smart enough and they need nutritional balance. Very important. They need the same nutritional balance you and I need. So if you compost truly by putting, you know, the leafy vegetable remains and cut up vegetables and, you know, leaves from some raking and these kinds of things, there's nothing much in that compost pile to reward that rat. Again, they must have protein, they must have carbohydrates, they must have sugars and energy just like us. And they may explore around a compost pile, but rarely will they invade it just because, you know, there's scraps of vegetables. Vegetables are not really high on their list, although they do eat some vegetables, but degrading vegetables are not going to give much nutritional reward. The last thing I'll mention about the compost is during the winter here in New England, you know, you're going to be generating heat, of course. And so on a cold snap sometimes, because rats do not hibernate, they do not hibernate. And so they have to be up all winter long getting food or finding a warm shelter. Sometimes some mice and small shrews and stuff will generate towards that heat coming off a compost pile, and they will establish a burrow nearby. But that's no reason to not compost. I hope everyone would continue to compost. They do not cause rats, but keep an eye on the area during the winter if there's rats in your neighborhood.
So I'm going to go back to Ravi, who had a couple of questions. Ravi?
Yeah, so just a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure.
So what tools have you seen large construction sites use to do the survey that you talked about? And then
Well,
second, what can neighborhoods do? What tools have neighborhoods done who don't have the resources of a large construction company? And finally, we think we've gotten rid of them on our property, but are they going to remember that this was a good place and come back? I mean, does that happen?
So let me take that last question first, Robbie. So rats do have a memory for areas that provided rewards. As long as the rewards continue, they will continue to visit, and they do lay down pheromones, chemical scent that, is in their droppings and in their urine and other body secretions, and they will lay those down, which continue to help the colony pick up on those pheromone trails and find that property too. So a success of the colony from the big scale, right? So, but after a few visits, if you eliminate anything that's going to attract them to your property or that they found, that's why I say, you want to button down your property. No reward means we need to move on. And that's what they learned, by the way, with the pandemic, is what happened to the gravy train. All the food around the restaurants is not out at night. They moved on. It was clear science of this neighborhood is no longer effective for us. We're dying of starvation. So they moved on. So what can the construction site do? What tools do they have? And this, again, I'm going to be very clear and frank. Most construction sites, by contract, are required to have a pest control company service to prevent rat problems. The issue there is that becomes a very simple service of a pest control company putting out the black boxes around the construction fence, usually on the inside, at spacings like 50 to 100 feet. And they'll say, that's rat prevention to keep the rats in the site. It certainly is not.
Yeah.
So I would say, construction sites need to be held to a much higher degree of making sure they're responsible for any rats they disturb. But that has to be in conjunction, again, with the city, because it wouldn't be the construction contractor's fault either if the sewers already have 150 rats right below their site. So it's a partnership that has to be worked on. But rarely do I see that on any city code, quite frankly, right? Go ahead.
If I can embellish on that, what we'd like to find out is what are cutting edge tools to ask a developer to use to survey subterraneanly and get a good read on what's happening and what the thriving population might be under their site.
So yeah, and that's a key question also. And I would say, for example, if the construction firm is going to set up a major piece of construction, is it going to affect the sewers? It is going to affect the waterways. It's going to affect underground infrastructures. There's all kinds of tools that they have themselves, crawlers that can be put into sewers. I mean, other cities, their sewer technology for inspections is incredibly great. So there's all kinds of surveys for sewers that can be scoped out, that can be looked at. Reports can be made, and two, keep in mind, if there are rats in those sewers and in that construction area, they must have food. So they're going to be foraging, not just in the sewers, they're coming up, they're foraging about, there's going to be signs that they're visiting someplace to get their food supply as well. Those surveys are going to produce that result, right? Again, I'm just saying that often it is dismissed as we have a pest control company, we're clear. They're going to take care of this. And and nobody holds it to a higher standard, any place in the United States that I have found.
So I just want to ask a question. We have a lot of large construction projects, but we also have a number of smaller construction projects. Have you seen other cities or municipalities put the same type of requirements on the smaller development projects as the larger ones? I mean, is there a size limit in terms of how cities deal with this problem?
Amy, the short answer is no, I've not seen anyone address it in that phrase. Should it be? And the answer is yes, right? For example, I do see, especially when there's an old house demolition. Usually cities have a demolition code, and for the dust and so forth, and how it would be done and how it would be contained. And they'll also have on that rats. The assumption is if it's an old house that's been abandoned and it's been sitting for 3 months and nobody lives in it, it must be like, you know, some Hollywood movie for Halloween. And there's these vermin with big teeth hiding in that old house, haunted house. And so somebody better do something before you tear it down. Otherwise you'll chase them everywhere. But what you'll see there, someone puts out bait boxes and says it is being treated. The term often will say it is being exterminated for rats. And everyone says, well, that's what we want, to exterminate. So on a small scale like that, I think it's very similar to the big scale, to the big jobs. Amy, it's just a matter of scale. When you go to the big construction projects of a giant new office building in downtown Newton, it's the same thing, only more rodent control equipment gets installed. Not more sophistication, just more rodent control equipment.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Oh, there was a question that came about regarding trash bins and whether, so we have hinged trash bins that we use here in the city, and whether rats can get into those and lift up the lids and somehow get into our trash barrels. Is that a concern?
It's a major concern, you know, and so whatever trash containers Newton uses, from residential on up through commercial, should be very, very carefully considered in rat-free Newton, or whatever you're going to call it, if you do call it something. So can they lift up those lids? If it is a quality container and high density plastic, you know, not a container with you can get for $29.95 at the local Home Depot with really cheap plastic. But if it's a good high density plastic with a snap down lid, rats cannot get that lid up. Now, if it's just a low density plastic with a snap down lid, they'll gnaw through the lid. Okay, so it's all about the materials. And most people, the last thing they want to spend money on is their garbage cans. So they'll put in very cheap garbage cans, and maybe that 1 in 10 neighbor I'm talking about that, you know, they're just like, hey, don't make a big deal. It's just taking out the garbage. Well, taking out the garbage has to be done very, very carefully with details paid attention. Otherwise, the rats will go through your can or they'll lift the lids on that. So I would say to everybody, if you're here, if you're not sure whether or not your cans are keeping out rats, or, you know, if you're like, well, I think they're okay, it's probably not good enough of an answer. You know, either use really good quality metal cans with a tight lid. And if there's raccoons in your neighborhood, you're going to use bungee cords as well. And or buy a high density, tight fitting lid, quality refuse can, and keep it clean. Clean it once a week with 10% bleach, the inside, the outside, because just, you know, even if the lid's down, but the outside smells like food because it hasn't been cleaned in 3 months, that alone will suck the rats to your property. The smell of the food residues in the outside of a garbage can that's closed tightly. So you have, it's the whole thing.
Thank you so much. Dr. Corrigan, I am so grateful that you were able to spend some time with us today to discuss your experiences with rats in other municipalities. Again, thank you so much for your time. I mean, just to sum up a little bit, I think what I'm hearing is that there really needs to be a strong partnership between the city, that's led by the city, and forged with our business community as well as our residents, to make sure we get on top of an issue, particularly when we're hearing a number of rat sightings. So not only do we need strong ordinances and requirements on the big developers, but we also need to do it on the small size, just smaller size developments, but just scale it appropriately. And that we need to make sure that we conduct environmental surveys as part of that plan. And we have to go deep down into the sewer level, the subterranean level, the street level, and even the off the street level, because as you mentioned, rats like ceilings too. Who knew? But thank you so much again for your time, folks. Thank you for your questions. I really believe that it's really important that any kind of issue that faces our community, particularly when they impact our quality of life, we need to air it, we need to discuss it, we need to learn more about it so that we can figure out a way to deal with the problem. Thank you for this open exchange of information and ideas. I'm hoping to have more forums like this. If there are other questions that you have, please send them to teamsangiolo@gmail.com. We'll get those to Dr. Corrigan if they weren't asked already, and we'll find those answers for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the honor.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.